I have been connecting with a lot of influential libertarian thought leaders, and it is a total blessing. I'm extremely excited about it, and I've got more to come. But it was really important that I connect with if not a progressive, a left leaning libertarian. And in fact, the guest who I just spoke with and who you're about to hear from is a self described left leaning libertarian. So, what is the difference between a left leaning libertarian and an anarcho capitalist? That's kind of lingo in the libertarian community. But more importantly, what does it mean to be free? What does it mean to honor the individual in society? Those are the questions that were the theme of this conversation. And it was awesome. Excited for you to hear it. Have I been pulled back to the left a little bit? Yes, I have. This conversation pulled me back to the left a little bit. So obviously, I've got a long way to go, and I'm not. I'm a long ways away from being able to say this is my political identity, but every conversation is like a notch on my bedpost, so to speak. And hopefully by the time the election rolls around, I'll have clarity. But if not, I'm making great progress. I'm making great connections, and this was a wonderful conversation, and I'm excited for you to hear it. So without further ado, enjoy. Thanks for being here, and see y'all next week. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Searching for Political Identity. I'm here with my new friend, Gaijin girl. Did I say
Hi,
it correctly? I
you
did.
did Gaijin.
We went over it enough right before we recorded, so I hope I nailed it. Apologies to the Japanese community if I did not. You're telling me that's a Japanese slur for the word foreigner, and you picked that nickname because you're such a foodie for Japanese food. You spent so much time in that part of town, and it just stuck,
That's pretty much it. Yeah.
right?
Mm,
So appreciate your time, Gaijin girl.
thanks.
Are you in New York or
I'm
oh,
from the Bronx,
right?
so
So I'm from New Jersey. I moved to California, San Diego, just over a decade ago for work. And I've been doing my thing in construction management. And I went to law school and graduated in 2022. And I've always had a somewhat interest in politics, and it's picked up and with the current events and law school and studying CRT in law school. Never being totally comfortable with identity politics, CRT being the ultimate manifestation of that,
mhm.
um, and just searching for political identity. Do I want to keep voting for Democrats like I have my whole life because that's the house I was raised in? Now I'm evaluating as a man, right? As an adult, really now it's like let me do this process and see if I want to double down on the Democrat thing or go a different direction and for what reason. So
I've
I've
got a lot
been
to say about that.
yeah, so I've been connecting with a lot of libertarians and very fortunate to have connected with several of the leading presidential candidates. Kind of interesting, fun, and bizarre and um, exciting. But do I want to be a libertarian? You were in that world for a while, right?
I was, and I would, if I were going to slap a label on myself, I'd call myself a left libertarian now.
Mm. Mm.
But in the U.S., libertarian is generally branded as the laissez-faire version of it, and that doesn't fit me at all anymore.
So laissez-faire meaning let's get the government out of all private transactions, let the
Mhm.
market forces be the controlling entity in society, let everything work itself out. That's how it goes. That's a core component, as far as I understand, of libertarianism.
It
And you're
is.
you're not liking that.
No, but that's the laissez-faire part of it. But the if you want to dig down deeper, the core of libertarianism, whether you're talking right wing or left wing, and that's a framework that's kind of flawed anyway. But right
Right?
wing versus left
Is the
wing, yeah,
core.
it's like the core is freedom of the individual.
Right.
And that drills right into the definition of freedom itself. Not to mention the whole concept of whether or not a quote unquote free market, or rather private market, is beneficial to an individual's freedom. And that's where you're going to see
Mm.
this the schism between laissez-faire libertarians and left libertarians.
Really interesting. Yeah. That's fascinating. So the anarcho-capitalist, the full bore, privatize everything, private market
Mhm,
should be dominant.
mhm.
They would say just basically let it all happen, whereas the people on the left would say no, to protect the individual's freedom, which is supremely important. We all agree that
Mhm.
you need some state role, a minimum, at least a minimal state entity role to protect, to do something
Right.
for.
That would be the night watchman concept. It's also called minarchist
Right,
or monarchist.
right.
Um, that's true. But again, you need to take a look and say, okay, what do you mean by freedom? And it's good that you bring up anarcho-capitalism because believe me, I kicked around those circles for a while.
That's where I
And
am right now. Yeah.
oh,
Just
we
in terms of
really
kicking
got
it
to talk.
around, not to
Yeah,
say that
yeah,
I'm landing there, but that's
yeah.
where I'm reading that book right now, so to speak.
Oh, sure. And it's I think it was really looking at the concepts behind anarcho-capitalism and a few of the questions that don't really get addressed. It's kind of like circular logic that led me to say, hey, this isn't quite right, but if I take this other premise, that leads me in that direction.
Hmm.
Because if you look at, I mean, if you want to go into this rabbit hole, because it's a really good one. Um, anarcho-capitalists believe it's like everything. Everything. We're talking the courts, we're talking the military, we're
Hmm.
talking the
Right.
police.
Yes.
All of it's private.
Right.
Now sit down and think about what that would do for a
Well, it would
second.
create disparities, right? Wealthy people
Huge.
would they'd
Yeah.
they'd have services that were adequate, presumably, but what about people who
Mhm.
can't pay for those services?
Yeah. What
That's a
if
big
what if
question.
what if you're like, I mean, what if you're like a vulnerable female and you just happen to be poor and you can't
Mhm.
afford not to be mugged or worse
Right.
in society because you didn't pay your police dues?
Right.
Is that a society that you want to create and live in?
Certainly not. And the question then becomes what is probably likely to happen? And the fact that that scenario exists logically, reasonably, hypothetically, certainly gives one cause for concern. And that's the first thing I thought of. The reply would probably be, well, I mean, there would be a market for that. It might not be as good, but that's life. It's harsh. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and what it works out to is when you think about it, that's life turns into might makes right. Something else.
Might or well or means. Yeah, I
Yeah,
guess it
or
becomes a matter
means.
of your ability to buy your way into those
Mhm.
with might makes right.
And this also brings up something else that I've been trying to drill home on social media. I'm not sure how many people are actually getting it, but let's look at the definition. And here's one of the problems with right wing libertarianism: is they make this dichotomy situation between private and government, public. But if you define government correctly, it's whatever entity, individual, or organization has enough power to make the rules and enforce them.
Mhm. Right.
So any strong enough private system is government. So that's actually a very false dichotomy.
And that actually plays into the note that I just wrote down that I wanted to make sure that I circled back to, which is this idea that wouldn't one of the retorts to this concern that we're talking about, which is what about the vulnerable woman who happens to be
Mhm.
poor? Um, what about the response of, well, is it any better than what we have now? Is it any worse than what we have now? Because what we have now is arguably a flawed justice system where money rules.
Mhm.
So there's that argument.
But we got to stay away from the false dichotomy even there then, because what we have is vastly dysfunctional. We need a
Mhm.
completely different system of checks and balances, no question. But you couldn't say that this is like a legitimate public square situation. Look at it. We don't even have community control over the police.
Right. Right. So okay, so yeah, I mean, it's you're a libertarian. You're just a minarchist. There's a role.
Not,
Let's
no, I'm not a minarchist at all. That would be the right wing laissez faire view.
okay.
I'm what would be called a left libertarian. And before we get to that, and please do circle back around to that with me,
Mhm.
but you really have to talk about what's meant by freedom, because one of the huge rules in laissez-faire libertarianism is the idea of non-initiation of violence,
The non-aggression principle, the famous
non-aggression.
non-aggression principle that you hear about,
That's
right?
that drives everything.
Mhm.
Okay, but so guy decides he wants to mug me. He walks up to me in an alleyway, and he goes, "Your money, your money, or I shoot you." I'm free to say no. Violence doesn't change that at all. And if you want to argue, well, you got to like do what you need to do to survive, which is what you argue with markets as well. It's like, well, you got to, be realistic, and you don't get things given to you. You have to like live with what there is. By that argument, either I am able to fight back, or oh well, because I'm
Yeah, I
free.
guess the idea so I guess the idea is, would you want a police officer at the other end of 911 on the ready, or would you want a private security officer at the ready of a private phone number on the ready? Either way, probably most likely that
Mhm.
officer is not getting to you in the time that you need it.
Probably not. But even more than that, even more than that, let's look at the principle. Why what's the underlying assumption behind why initiation of violence is wrong? It doesn't take away freedom.
Well, it takes away someone else's freedom, right? I
It
mean,
doesn't. It depends how you define freedom. Again, I can say no and I can do something about it. But if you really look at it, the argument is that violence is so detrimental to human welfare that that's something that's got to be cut out of the equation.
hmm,
So, in other words, you're saying that, okay, there are certain things that we have to say are no nos. One of them being
right,
violence, which I would
right,
agree with.
right.
But once you say that, you can also say, hey, there are other things that are just as detrimental. The
Hmm,
same, violence, pointing a gun at me is coercion. However,
certainly.
saying, okay, you're going to do X, Y, and Z, or you're going to starve and you're going to be out on the street, that's coercion too. It's economic,
Right.
but it's
So you're
still.
arguing for a social safety net. You're for the presence of a social safety net.
Mhm. I'm arguing that more, and more than what we have. Again, we have a really, really bad system.
Right.
Anything which is a human need, a modern human need, that you cannot say no to without extreme detriment,
hmm
be guaranteed.
So this is perfect. This is a concept that you get exposed to in law school. Many people, I'm sure, damn near every libertarian understands the concept. I certainly did not before law school, but that is a positive liberty and negative liberty. This is
Yeah.
exactly your point. The American Constitution, way of life, history, based on negative liberty. The concept that
Mhm.
the government cannot do X, Y, and Z to you.
Mhm.
So negative liberty is what the government can't do to you, whereas
Mhm.
positive liberty is a newer idea, and it's the idea that the government must provide A, B, and C. It's what you're talking about. It's in this society, in this way of life, we're going to provide some basics. That's just what freedom means.
And it's not really all that new. I mean, Thomas Paine was in favor of a minimum basic income.
Right.
Thomas Paine, one of the
Right.
founding fathers. And any form of government that exists, like whether it's like a government that creates roads, that has a military, that has courts, it's implicitly saying, okay, here are these services that have to be ground zero. In our current system, it's military, it's courts, it's fire departments,
hmm
and the question becomes,
Hmm.
what should that ground zero be? And
Yes.
and what you have to go back to answer that is, what is your core axiomatic goal for
hmm
government or for any of your values?
Hmm. Right.
And if, and I would hope that everyone would agree with this, if it is human life and human well-being, which, if anyone's walking around
I
going,
hope it is for everybody, and
if anyone's
I
walking
like
around,
to assume that it is. Frankly,
yeah,
I like to assume that it is.
yes,
Really.
it is. And I think that, almost nobody thinks that they're a bad guy.
Right.
Nobody wakes up and says, "Hey, I'm
Right.
going to be the bad guy and do horrible things." But you have to actually look, okay, if your goals are human life and welfare, I'm
Hmm.
not saying go get a Lamborghini. I'm not saying free movie tickets for all. I'm saying that people don't feel coerced and they can choose for themselves their path in life, blah, blah, blah. They can fulfill their potential. Then there are basics that you need to fulfill. And it's just a matter of where you draw that line
Yeah.
and where you recognize that that line needs to be drawn.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point. And of course, again, the anarcho-capitalist would say ground zero needs to be at the way beginning, where unwind it all. No
Yeah,
fire stations, no police stations, no nothing. But I like what you're saying. Whereas, hey, if the reality we're in is that services are provided, it's a matter of what they are. Yeah,
exactly. So
yeah,
the only people that would be saying no services at all would be an anarcho-capitalist.
right.
Anyone else, even the most hard, fast libertarian, would be saying we need some things.
Yeah, they would say at least we need the courts, like you said, we need the police, we need some of those um, positive as in existing institutions that do things in the world literally to protect your freedoms. So
Mhm.
the minarchist maybe would say the bare minimum state necessary, government necessary to protect those negative liberties, to make sure that the government does it. So it's kind of the
Yeah,
anarcho-capitalist would say, dude, you see where you're getting tripped up already? If it's all about protecting, so if it's all about protecting your freedoms, the fact that, well, they would say the state is the biggest violator of rights to begin with, so get rid of the state.
yeah, and that goes right back to my point about the state versus private actually being a false dichotomy. I don't know if you remember.
Mm.
It was probably, I think it was 2017. There was a Vietnamese doctor who booked a plane. They overbooked the plane.
Oh yeah, and he
Yeah,
got bloodied up in the
he
nose or
got
something.
bloodied up. They dragged him off. They broke his teeth.
Yeah.
It's like this was a private company.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So any company, any organization, no matter how private, that is strong enough and has enough uh, juice behind it is the government. It's that's what feudalism is. Think about this. I think we all agree feudalism was a bad thing.
Give me the 30-second rundown on feudalism.
Okay,
Lords, the state
lords,
managers,
yes,
serfs, working the
serfs,
land,
yes,
basically, basically like slaves.
yeah,
What am I
basically like
missing?
slaves. They owed everything to the Lord, and they had to do everything, and basically the Lord could do anything they wanted with them. Now, you take regular capitalism, which always it accumulates, it snowballs wealth. There's always a disparity, and it will always increase.
Mhm.
You
Mm.
keep this is what Marx would have called late stage capitalism. Um, you give it enough time, capitalism is feudalism. And then okay, the
Mm.
Lord's got it. The Lord's invested right, and they therefore have the wealth, and these other people don't. You have the exact same hierarchy, and it's just the same problems. They just call them different labels.
It's interesting. When Mark says capitalism, when he uses that phrase, is he meaning what the anarcho-capitalists mean, which is the voluntary exchange, basically? Is that how Marx views capitalism, do you think?
Well, now, mind you, I'm not a Marxist,
Sure.
so I'm definitely not an expert in Marx. I've got a lot of Marxist friends, and I find that there's a lot of Venn overlap between what I believe and the conclusions that Marxians draw. But I can't speak to everything he said.
Sure. Right.
But he would definitely say that any system where all of the means of production and capital is becomes ever more accumulated into a few hands, then you have that problem.
You know what I find most interesting is where these different factions of political ideologies could potentially find things to agree on. And
Yes,
I would love to hear an anarcho-capitalist say to Marx, "Hey, we're against that too, and our perspective is the state is the creator of monopolies, the concentrator of wealth."
that's what they
I'd love
say,
right?
and the state can do that, and that's a problem. However, so can just anarcho-capitalism. The issue is one of the points that caused me to drift to the left on the political compass, which, by the way, yeah, I'm sure everyone who listens to you has taken the political compass test, the four quadrant test.
Mhm.
And if they haven't, they should. Um, it's like the vertical axis is freedom, individual personal freedom, and horizontal is economic freedom. That's also a faulty framework, but it's good
Mm.
for ballpark. I basically didn't even move on the vertical. I just went straight across
To the left, of course.
to
Yeah.
the left.
And so what did that?
One of the things that did that was I had a career in finance, and I got to see how markets work and do not work up close. It's one thing when you're first getting into politics and you're younger, and all of these neoliberal models sound really, really good, and they show you a graph, and it's like, ooh, this works. By the way, in some other conversation, we're going to have to talk about the assumptions that are inherent in those graphs because a
Mm,
lot of it is BS.
mm.
But once you see how a market works and how economies work, you realize that a lot of what's billed as a meritocracy is not.
And that's the big point, that's the underlying thing. If everything is a meritocracy, then maybe there's an argument for this stuff. But if our society really is, I don't want to use the word rigged, but
Mhm.
rigged,
Dysfunctional.
set up so where the wealthy are just disproportionately able to increase their wealth, then perhaps meritocracy is not the word we should be using.
Yeah, no. And
Yeah.
honestly, you could have a world where people are forced to fight to the death, and it would still be called a meritocracy, depending how you define meritocracy, because
Yeah.
you win if you win.
Yeah.
But is that good for the end goal, the axiomatic end goal?
What about the idea that the anarcho-capitalist would say, okay, obviously, if everyone was left to fight for themselves, then we would have a horrible situation. Babies would be dying all over the place, but we don't have that. What about the concept that they just want to decentralize? What if what would you say to them who said, we just want to put the onus back on the individual, the family, the community? What
Well,
if it's just a matter of getting rid of the federal?
I would say that that doesn't decentralize because, again, private capital will monopolize and accumulate as well. And then that'll be the government. Number one. Number
Mm,
two, and I'm glad you brought this up. Um, Another false dichotomy, kind of, or rather misframing, that I see a lot with laissez faire libertarianism is we're for the individual and we're against collectivism. However, in a capitalist system, the individual is forced to basically, for lack of a better word, prostitute themselves to as many people as they possibly can. It's called a wage. It's called selling goods in order to survive. That's not individualistic. That is the most toxic collectivism that you can imagine.
hmm.
And yet that's anarcho-capitalism.
And how do you mean it's collectivist?
Well, because you can't, that's when you have to earn a wage, you're relying, in order to do things like, for instance, get food, have a
Mhm.
house over your head,
You're
a roof
plugging
over your
into a system
head.
that you did not create.
You're plugging into a system and you're having to cater to as many people as you possibly can just to live. That's actually very anti-individual, extremely anti-individual.
Is there any concern that if we were to give everyone a minimum basic income and you don't have to work,
You
you
don't
could
have
just you could just uh, chill. I don't want to say
to do
chill, but
that.
pursue creative endeavors,
Mhm.
read, just
Yes,
kind of pursue your own happiness. Um, is there
you
any
will.
concern, having studied economics, is there any
Mhm.
concern that that would like be a productive? Is productivity a problem? False concern.
Productivity would not be a problem, and let me tell you why. Number one is human nature. Not everyone's going to sit on their sofa and eat Cheetos. The average human being wants to do things. The question is, what do they want to do? Now, a lot of
Mm,
the things you mentioned, like read a book or say pursue start up a business that you think would be a good idea or better yourself to develop a skill, all those things are actually work. It's just a matter of whether or not it's monetizable in a market system. But that can be just as equally important to society. And for anything that's like, say, more nuts and bolts, like say you've got people who need to collect the trash and blah blah blah, that's obviously needed. That you can have a market system. It's like, okay, here's another thing that's great is if you create this baseline there, it's like you can opt out of the wage system and just, get by and do your
mhm.
own thing if you want to. And I don't know, read up on poetry, whatever you want to do.
Search for your political identity.
Just for your political identity, do a
Mm,
podcast.
mhm.
um, then, in order for any employer to attract you, they actually have to offer something that's worthwhile. You
Mhm.
can still get people to do whatever needs to be done. You just got to offer them a bit more. And not only that, but take a look at our current system where, obviously people can't do whatever they want to do because they have to pay the bills.
Mhm.
One of the things that means is that the entire charity system is geared toward the idle rich.
Right. Right. So they determine who gets help.
Exactly. Because they're the ones that can volunteer and they're the ones that can donate.
Mm, that is interesting. And you wouldn't need as much of that charity if you switched to a healthy minimum income. Anyway,
Exactly.
yeah. Yeah, no, it's got its allure just as anarcho-capitalism does. I mean, this makes sense to do what is necessary to give people the baseline to pursue
Mhm.
their freedom, their truth, their happiness. Is that not freedom?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's
And
it's
it that version recognizes a market truth that anarcho-capitalism doesn't, which is when you look at economic graphs, there's a concept called the steepness of the curve.
I'm
And the
going to
steeper
pretend to be familiar with that when I have
yeah,
no idea what that means.
the steeper the curve is, the less of a change you have if you hike up prices because people need it. It's like, for instance, food. You may cry and complain if food goes up, but you still got to eat. If a video game goes up, you can go, I don't want to play it. Anarcho capitalism doesn't really acknowledge that there are certain goods that you can't say no to. And not only that, but it's not like there's any such thing like a perfect competition. Like, I can't walk down the street tomorrow and go, hey, that hospital over there, they're charging too much for their MRI. Let me build one.
Right.
It's called, a barrier to entry. Not everything is Adam Smith easy competition. It's not like setting up a food cart.
Right. Yeah, and they would have you believe that the state, the system that we have, the Federal Reserve, this is what causes inflation and what causes
Mm.
all this stuff, and you're not buying that, and I
No,
like it.
no.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
like it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we'll have to have a conversation about MMT as well too. I'm
Yeah,
not.
give me no,
Yeah,
do you have a few minutes to
yeah.
dive into that?
Oh yeah, sure. And
Yeah.
I'm not like, I don't walk around talking about MMT all the time. but it's a very valid look at currency. Because remember that what currency simply
We're
is
talking modern monetary
yeah,
theory for anyone,
modern
right?
monetary theory, right? All money is taking a unit of measurement like you would have, inches on a yardstick, um, to put toward what is considered value for various goods, including labor and what have you. Now, think about. I highly recommend anyone who has not read Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, do so, because it's beautiful work. It's an easy read, and she explains the concepts very well. Now, imagine a world where basketball games, you only had X number of points. So if one person got a point, the other person couldn't get a point. That's dysfunctional. And that's
Okay.
the same situation you have when you tie currency to something like the gold standard, because it's an artificial restriction. Now, it's not true that MMT says, oh, you can spend forever and there'll never be inflation. The issue is that until an economy is running at full productivity, and that means in terms of full employment, full use of resources, then you can spend, because that money will go to other services that there's no money for, but people want. Once you reach full productivity, then it's dollars chasing different goods, and you do have inflation. But think about, for instance, say I was making more money and I was able to afford a maid, which would be really great because I'm not the best.
Hell
I'm
yeah.
not the best housekeeper in the world. Um, I don't hire them because I don't have the money. If there was, just if there was money to put into that, that's X number of more jobs, and that's more people getting, the capitalism is driven by a lack, a non-full employment. Why? What? One of the great things that Bernie put forward and that the Greens put forward is, have you ever heard of the federal job guarantee?
Not no, I don't think so.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Okay. The federal job guarantee is the concept that anyone who wants to work should be able to work.
I like that. That sounds pretty good.
There's plenty of things in communities that are not done that need to be done. And we're not talking just make work stuff like, okay, clean up the street. There's teaching, there's building like better infrastructure, there's, what have you. Um, and what a federal job guarantee would do is say, hey, um, we're going to, turn unemployment offices into employment offices. If you want to work and the private market is not giving you an option, come to us and we'll find you something legitimate. And that lets society monetize things that the private market won't necessarily do. Think about all the things in your city that could make the place better. That just doesn't happen. There's no reason. There's no reason that people can't be paid for this through the federal dollar. And until and unless everybody is working at full capacity, you're not going to see the inflation, because it's just going to expand to more services and more
Hmm.
individuals.
Yeah, I need to study the economics. Lord knows that it's about the last thing that I'm an expert in the world, the furthest thing from even understanding. And I have been studying a little bit the political philosophies, the personalities, the flavors, the surface level feelings of what these ideas mean and what is
Mhm.
the proper role of government. And there's no doubt that I'm quickly realizing that a lot of this is economics and what theory you subscribe to.
It
Again,
is.
the anarcho capitalist, going back to the Austrian school of economic thought, whatever the hell that means. I'm going to get to the readings. I'm going to do all the readings of all these thinkers, and that's the next step. Is actually once I get done with some things that I have in my personal life over the next few months that I really need to take care of, I got to study the great works and get this understanding that you have a little bit of a head start on me on.
Yeah, and no matter what you read, I highly recommend every single label that you see, every single word that you see. Don't just accept, what it's assumed to be. Sit down, deconstruct the concept. Look at, okay, what is the full definition? Are there any assumptions in here? It's like, how is it begging the question if it is? Don't just assume that, you see a lot of throwing around labels and then they don't actually describe what they are. You get that a lot in economics,
Hmm.
a whole ton. And that's a way to play basically a magic act. And you're talking within a bubble and you're not describing real life.
Right.
Every single concept must be constructed physical reality. Anything that's abstract, you better be able to tie it back, because otherwise you're not you're basically playing propaganda. You're not looking at what is,
Yeah. No,
and
that's
that's
exactly what I was thinking, which is, if there's 20 or if there's 75 great works between all the ideologies, and I want to read them all, I would venture to guess that it's highly unlikely that I'm going to pick one of them and say, that's it. That's the one I'm going with. It all makes sense. And I'm going to live like that's the Bible.
Mhm,
Highly unlikely. More likely is to do a composite and figure out what makes sense in the context of reality. Um,
mhm.
and I do wonder about the anarcho capitalists, because they seem to be, whether, I don't know the name, Ludwig von Mises or Rothbard, whatever the hell the names are of these that they
So
love.
well.
If they basically are saying, hey, this is the Bible, guys, like this is the answer, and I believe that, or are they just doing a thing where they say, no, that's what we have to aim at, knowing we're never going to get there, but are they just using that as a target, so to speak? Either way, they believe it, and it's interesting. But yeah, I would imagine that at the end of my journey, if I ever get there, that it's going to be a composite.
Yeah, it is. And always drill it down to, what is the end goal? What is the axiomatic end goal?
Right.
What are you trying? What are you driving at?
And what is the goal? And this is what I picked up from talking to people who I consider thought leaders for just a few years now. Trade-offs. What is the goal? What do you want? What's the system? What are the rules? And then, hey, there might be some misalignment there. That's where change and politics comes in, and efforts and activism. But what is your goal and what are the trade-offs? Because there's always going to be trade-offs. And it's like you said, about having a clear goal and being willing to take the trade-offs.
But even when you do the trade-offs, even if you say, okay, this is a good trade-off, sit down and deconstruct what principle there is that makes that an acceptable trade-off, and then apply it consistently.
Right. And
So in
that's
other words,
and
yeah. No, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's I thank you so much for your time and for your advice, and that's what I'm going to do. And it's about finding the principles. That's what I'm searching for. Is searching for the principles, and that's why I've been so attracted to libertarianism, because there are so many clear principles. Though there's a notion of diversity within libertarianism, I would say it has the clearest principles of the three major parties, and so that's I'm attracted to that. Maybe you disagree, but there are clear guideposts, non-aggression principle, things like that. But maybe as I dig deeper, maybe it gets mushier.
Well, I don't think it gets mushier. I think you've always got to look at, when you say freedom, ask yourself what that actually means.
Yeah,
And again, ask yourself, if are we better off living in a world where basically corporations can become the new feudal lords?
right.
Does that help
Yeah,
freedom in
I
any
know
way, shape, or
nobody
form?
wants to be serfs. And
Yes.
so We can
anyone.
start there. Nobody wants serfdom. So, yeah, I love this has been really helpful. What is the goal? And you can honor the individual in the goal
Mm,
without being anarcho-capitalist. I think that's a profound insight for me.
thank you. Then
Yeah.
that was the catalyst for me to go from laissez-faire to left libertarian. And I've to quote somebody who the anarcho-capitalists would love, uh, but they won't love my conclusion for it. Ayn
Ayn
Rand
Rand. Yeah.
said, check your premises. And that should be done with anarcho-capitalism too.
Mm. She was an anarcho-capitalist.
She was close. She was really more of a minarchist. She admitted that you needed a night watchman state from her philosophy, but she didn't like that. She didn't like that. She wanted to be an anarcho-capitalist.
That's
But
interesting.
you can use that. You can use her concepts in ways that I would argue deconstruct and debunk her philosophy. Check your premises. Never
I know.
assume anything is correct.
Mhm. Right. No, I mean, that fits right in with the general feeling I had, which is to look behind the door and search for truth, and it's
Mhm.
a journey, and I'm on it, and
Definitely
you
is.
are awesome, and I'm really grateful for your time, seriously.
You're awesome too, and thank you for the time. And I'm happy to like expound on this again.
I would love to do another conversation at some point in the near future. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Gaijin girl, it's been a pleasure and seriously very grateful. Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah, have a great